She didn't choose him. Her father did. The night before the first snow sealed the mountain pass and made escape impossible. Evelyn Harper was 20 years old, standing in a stranger's doorway with a single trunk of belongings and a fury she couldn't swallow. The man inside didn't ask for her name. He just stepped back, handed her the only lantern, and said the bedroom was hers. She thought she'd been sold. She had no idea she'd just walked into the one place in the entire Frontier Valley where someone would finally treat her like she was worth something. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The valley didn't announce itself. One moment the wagon was grinding through a narrow throat of rock and pine, the wheels catching on roots and loose stone, the horses blowing hard through their nostrils in the thin air, and then the pass opened and there it was. A wide, flat-bottom valley cradled between two mountain ridges, the kind of place that looked peaceful from a distance and revealed its harshness only after you'd committed yourself to it. Evelyn Harper sat on the bench seat beside her father and said nothing. She had said very little for the last 4 days. Since Harrisburg. Since the conversation in the kitchen that had gutted her and left her standing in the middle of her own life like a stranger passing through. She pressed her fingers against the rough edge of the wagon seat and looked out at the valley below. It was beautiful. She would give it that. The aspen stands had already turned, burning gold and copper along the ridgeline, and the meadow grass was pale and silvered in the late afternoon light. A creek ran through the center of the valley floor, catching the sun in pieces. Smoke rose in thin columns from a cluster of structures near the creek, the settlement of Hatchfield, population somewhere under 200, depending on who had survived the previous winter and who had given up and turned back east. Her father, Thomas Harper, shifted on the bench beside her. He was 61 years old and looked 10 years beyond that. A lean, weathered man with hands that had done too much hard labor and lungs that had begun failing him in the spring. The cough had started in February. By June, it had the sound of something tearing. That was when he had written to his cousin Samuel, who had settled in Hatchfield 3 years prior, and asked about the possibility of land. Samuel had written back with news about land, and news about a man named Caleb Boone. "It's something, isn't it?" Thomas said. His voice had the careful quality of a man testing ice. "The valley." "It's a valley," Evelyn said. He let that sit for a moment. "Evie, don't." She kept her eyes on the ridgeline. "Not right now." He pressed his lips together and said nothing more. The wagon descended. Well, she had known something was wrong by the look on his face when he came in from the barn that August evening. Thomas Harper was not a man who fidgeted, but he had stood in the kitchen doorway for almost a full minute before he sat down, turning his hat brim through his hands in slow rotations while she finished washing the supper dishes. She had watched him in the window reflection, the way the lamplight deepened the lines in his face, and felt a cold unease settle in her stomach before he said a single word. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. She dried her hands on the dishcloth and turned around. He told her about Hatchfield, about Samuel's land offer, about the journey west before the first snow, pistas. They had to leave before the first snow. He was very clear about that, because the mountain passes closed and then you were stuck on whichever side you happened to be standing on. He told her about his lungs more honestly than he had before, the way doctors talked about it like a matter of degrees rather than a question of survival. He told her that he wanted to see her settled before the degrees ran out, and then he told her about Caleb Boone. "He's a trapper," Thomas said. "Good man. Been in the valley 3 winters, knows the land, knows how to keep a place running. He's got a solid cabin, a food store, a working smokehouse." He paused. "He's agreed to the arrangement." Evelyn heard the word arrangement and felt something close inside her chest like a door being shut. "Agreed," she said. "What arrangement?" "Marriage." Thomas put his hat on the table. "A proper one. Samuel vouches for him, says he's the most reliable man in the valley and the most decent. He doesn't drink, he doesn't have a temper. He's a stranger," Evelyn said. "I know. You're asking me to marry a man I have never met. I'm asking you to consider it." "You said agreed." Her voice was very quiet, which was the way her voice got when she was trying not to break something. "You said he agreed to the arrangement. That means you already asked him. That means it's already decided." Thomas didn't answer that. "How long ago?" she said. 3 weeks. She turned back to the counter and pressed both palms flat against the wood and stared at the wall. 3 weeks. He had been living in the same house with her for 3 weeks, eating supper across the table from her, asking how her day had gone, and carrying this arrangement in his pocket the whole time. "I'm 20 years old," she said. "Not a cow you're selling at auction. Evie, I'm not doing it." But she was. She understood that even as she said it. She understood the arithmetic of the situation with a clarity that made her furious precisely because she couldn't argue with it. Her mother had died 4 years ago. She had no brothers, no husband. Her father's lungs were tearing themselves apart. If she stayed in Harrisburg alone, she would be a 20-year-old woman with no property, no income, no one to take her in except distant relations who had already made clear they considered her presence a burden rather than a blessing. If she went to Hatchfield, she would be a 20-year-old woman married to a stranger in a place she had never been. Both options were terrible. One of them, at least, had a roof. The wagon rolled into Hatchfield at dusk, which meant Evelyn's first impression of the settlement was of mud, dim lamplight, and a smell that was equal parts livestock and wood smoke. The main track ran between 2 rows of structures: a general store, a feed supply, a smithy that had already banked its forge for the evening, a few houses pushed back behind split-rail fences. People moved through the evening with the purposeful quiet of those who had learned not to waste motion. Samuel Harper was waiting for them outside the general store. A stocky man in his 50s with Thomas's same jaw, but none of his father's particular sorrow. He helped Thomas down from the wagon with the careful respect of a man tending to illness, without naming it, and then he turned to Evelyn with genuine warmth. "Evie," he said, "Lord, you look exactly like your mother." She didn't know how to answer that. She accepted the hug and said it was good to see him and meant neither part of it. "You'll stay with me tonight," Samuel said. "Both of you, and tomorrow." He glanced at Thomas, something passing between them. "Tomorrow we'll get things sorted." Things sorted. Another word for the arrangement. She slept poorly in Samuel's spare room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the valley. The wind coming down off the ridge in long sighs, an owl somewhere close, the creek running below the settlement. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling planks and tried to construct a version of the future she could live inside of. Every version she built collapsed at the same wall. The man named Caleb Boone, whom she didn't know, who was supposedly decent and reliable, and who had agreed to marry her the way a man agrees to take on an extra cord of firewood before winter. Useful, necessary, decided. She fell asleep sometime before dawn and dreamed of Harrisburg, the kitchen, her mother's garden in July when the tomatoes came in heavy on the vine. She woke up to thin mountain light and the sound of her father coughing in the next room. They met Caleb Boone the following morning. Samuel led them to the edge of the settlement where the structures thinned out and the meadow began, and there was a man standing outside the smithy talking to the blacksmith about something mechanical, gesturing at what appeared to be a broken piece of harness hardware. He was tall, taller than Thomas by a head, with broad shoulders and the particular leanness of someone who spent most of their calories moving rather than storing them. He was maybe 30, or a hard 28, or an easy 33. His face was difficult to read in the same way that certain stretches of terrain are difficult to read. There were features there, individual components that were fine enough, but the overall expression was reserved in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. He turned when Samuel called his name and walked toward them without hurrying. "Mr. Harper," he said, and shook Thomas's hand. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't waste volume. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Miss Harper." "Mr. Boone," she said. A pause. He seemed to understand that she was not going to offer anything beyond that, and he didn't push. He looked at her with a steadiness that was neither aggressive nor dismissive, just present, the way a man looks at something he's trying to honestly assess. She looked back at him with the specific expression she had perfected in the last 4 days. Civil, contained, and approximately as warm as the mountain runoff in April. "I appreciate you making the journey," he said. "I know it's not a short one." "No," she said. "It isn't." Another pause. Samuel stepped in with the comfortable noise of a man filling awkward silence professionally, talking about the weather coming in from the northwest and the state of the south pasture, and a dozen other topics that allowed the 4 of them to stand together in the morning light without anyone having to address what they were actually standing there about. Evelyn watched Caleb Boone during this recital. He listened to Samuel the way he'd looked at her, fully, without performance. He didn't drum his fingers or check the sky or shift his weight. He just listened. When he had something to say, he said it in a sentence or two and then stopped. She found herself trying to locate the flaw, the tell, the thing that would explain why a man like this, capable, settled, not unpleasant to look at, had agreed to marry a woman he had never seen based on the description of a friend of her father's. She couldn't find it. That bothered her more than if she had. Tit. The ceremony was 3 days later. In a frontier settlement with a winter pressing down from the northwest, no one had the patience for lengthy preparations. Thomas Harper's cough had worsened in the thin mountain air, and he moved through those 3 days with a fragility that Evelyn couldn't ignore even when she was furious at him, which was most of the time. She helped him to a chair when his breathing went shallow. She made the tea that seemed to help. She sat across the table from him in Samuel's kitchen at night and tried to hold on to her anger because it was the only thing standing between her and something much more frightening, which was grief. She was losing him. She understood that. The cough was not the kind that got better. The thin mountain air was not helping, but the Harrisburg air had not been helping either, and at least here there was Samuel and land and the arrangement. On the morning of the third day, she put on the dress her mother had made for a different occasion. A visiting dress, deep green wool, not a wedding dress but the best she owned, and braided her hair and looked at herself in the small metal mirror in Samuel's spare room for a long time. "This is not what I wanted," she said to her reflection. Not angry, just stating it plainly. A record for whatever version of herself might review the evidence later. Then she went out and married Caleb Boone in front of Samuel, the settlement's magistrate, and approximately 11 neighbors who had come out of a combination of goodwill and frontier curiosity. Caleb had put on a clean shirt. His hair was combed. He stood straight and still during the brief ceremony and spoke as part of it in that same low, even voice. And when it was done, he shook the magistrate's hand and then turned to Evelyn with an expression she couldn't read. "Ready," he said. She picked up the small bag at her feet. "Lead the way." His cabin was a mile and a half north of the settlement, up a track that ran alongside the creek before cutting east into a stand of mixed pine and aspen. It was late afternoon when they arrived, Evelyn on the wagon seat beside him with her trunk in the back and the silence between them taking up more space than either of them. She had tried twice in the settlement to find a reason to dislike him clearly. A sharpness in his voice, an impatience in his manner, a way of looking at her that would confirm the worst version of what she feared. He had not cooperated. The cabin came into view as the track bent around a boulder outcropping, and she looked at it without speaking. It was not fancy. Nothing about Hatchfield was fancy, and a trapper's cabin a mile and a half from the settlement had no business being fancy, but it was solidly built, she could see that. The logs fitted close, the chinking fresh, the roof sound. There was a small porch across the front face with a bench to one side. A woodpile beside the eastern wall that was already substantial, stacked in tight parallel rows. A smokehouse set back at a careful distance. A small barn and a corral with 2 horses visible over the fence rail. Someone had spent time on this place. Not to make it beautiful, to make it work. Caleb set the brake and climbed down and went around to the back to lift her trunk without being asked. She stepped down from the wagon on her own, not waiting for a hand. "I'll show you around," he said, already moving toward the door. Inside was one main room, clean and spare, with a stone fireplace on the north wall and a heavy work table and 2 chairs. Shelves along the west wall held organized rows of provisions, dried goods, canned stores, tools hung on pegs rather than scattered. A door in the back wall led to a second room, smaller, which held a narrow bed frame with a mattress covered by 2 wool blankets. He set her trunk at the foot of the bed. "Bedroom's yours," he said. She turned to look at him. "And where do you—" "I'll be fine." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the trunk, adjusting its angle slightly, as if this was the thing that required his attention. "There's a pallet in the main room. I sleep light. It's fine." She stood in the middle of the small bedroom and looked at the man who was technically now her husband, who had just given her the only enclosed sleeping space in a 2-room cabin and showed no sign of expecting any particular gratitude for it. "This is your house," she said. "It's your house too," he said. "That's the point." Then he went back out to the main room and she heard him moving around, and after a moment the sound of the fire being built up, the particular knock and settle of fresh wood on coals. Evelyn stood in the bedroom with her hands at her sides. Outside, through the single small window, the aspens were blazing gold in the last of the afternoon sun, and the sky above the ridge had gone the deep blue that comes just before the temperature drops. The first full night, the first of how many she couldn't count. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed. She had expected a man who would see her as property, who would make the terms of the arrangement known in that first hour, clearly and without apology, because that was what men in his position did when they had all the leverage. She had steeled herself for it. She had a speech prepared, actually, the outline of one, the shape of what she would say about what she would and would not accept, the lines she would hold. He had given her the bedroom and gone to sleep on the floor. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did nothing. She unpacked her trunk in careful order. Her mother's quilt, her extra dress, the small tin box with her letters in it, and arranged them in the spare room as if arranging them could constitute any kind of control over her circumstances. Then she went to the doorway of the main room. Caleb was at the fireplace, adjusting the damper. He glanced back when she appeared. "Supper'll be ready in about an hour," he said. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up." "Thank you," she said. The words came out stiffly. He nodded and turned back to the fire. She washed her face and hands and sat in one of the chairs at the work table and watched him cook without making it obvious she was watching. He moved through the space the way he did everything else, economically, without wasted motion, without performance. He had shot a rabbit that morning, apparently, and there was a stew coming together in the iron pot that smelled better than anything she had eaten since Harrisburg. He sliced bread from a heavy round loaf on the cutting board, added it to a plate without comment, and set the plate in front of her when the stew was ready. The best portion went to her plate. She noticed that too. They ate without talking much. Outside the cabin, the temperature fell fast as the sun left the valley. The fire did its work, and the main room held the heat. Somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called, high and thin, and was answered by another. "Does that bother you?" Caleb asked, nodding toward the sound. "No," she said. "I don't mind coyotes." Good. He went back to his food. Some people do. It was possibly the least significant exchange she had ever had with another human being, and she found herself thinking about it later, lying in the narrow bed under her mother's quilt, listening to him settle onto the pallet in the main room. The fire had banked itself down to coals. The cabin ticked and settled in the cold. "Does that bother you? Not a test, not a probe for weakness, just an honest question about coyotes." She pulled the quilt up to her chin and stared at the low ceiling and told herself it didn't mean anything. A man could be considerate in the first hours of an arrangement. That was strategy, not character. She would need more than a night before she trusted anything about Caleb Boone. She was still repeating this to herself when she fell asleep. Bad. The first week passed the way. The first weeks of most difficult things pass. In increments too small to measure and in the aggregate too significant to ignore. She was used to mornings with a rhythm to them, with a shape she had constructed herself. Here the rhythm was not hers yet, and the shape belonged to someone else's years of practice. She woke before dawn, as she always had, and found the fire already built up and a pot of coffee set back from the heat. He was always up before her by the time she emerged from the bedroom, already dressed and already in motion, checking the horses or patching something on the barn, or doing the particular quiet work of a man who had lived alone long enough that stillness felt natural. He didn't explain his movements. He didn't narrate his day or ask her to account for hers. He told her where things were when she needed to find them. The flour crock, the extra lamp oil, the tools in the lean-to, and answered her questions directly and without elaboration. "Where's the axe?" she asked on the fourth morning. "Lean-to left side, peg by the door. Take the short-handled one. The long one's got a loose head." She went and got the short-handled axe and split wood for an hour and brought it in and stacked it by the fireplace, and he came in from outside and looked at the stack and said thank you and went to wash his hands. That was how they communicated in that first week. Practical, efficient, two people in the same structure making the structure work. What she noticed underneath it, against her intentions, was the patience. She was difficult that week. She knew she was being difficult and was only partly sorry about it. She left responses short when they didn't need to be. She kept her face composed into the neutral expression she had decided was appropriate for a woman who had been arranged into marriage against her will. She did not smile. She did not offer warmth she didn't feel. When he asked if she would be all right alone while he went to set traps, she said yes in a tone that made it clear she was not asking for his concern. He absorbed all of this without comment. He didn't push back. He didn't become cold in response to her coldness, didn't respond to her distance with distance of his own. He simply continued being the same man in the same manner, day over day, as if her resentment were weather. Present, acknowledged, not something to take personally. That patience was more disorienting than anger would have been. She had prepared for anger. She had no preparation for a man who was simply steady. The thing about frontier life that no one in Harrisburg had adequately described to her was the relentlessness of the work. There was no division here between the time when you worked and the time when you didn't. The work was continuous and seasonal, and if you fell behind it, the consequences were concrete. The smokehouse needed replenishing. The chickens they'd purchased from a neighbor needed tending. The kitchen garden, such as it was this late in the season, needed whatever could still be pulled from it before the hard freeze came. Wood needed to be split and stacked, and the stack that looked adequate in October turned out to be nowhere near adequate in January if you didn't know the valley winters. Caleb knew the valley winters. He spent those early October weeks in a state of near constant motion that she began to understand was not anxiety, but preparation. He checked the cabin's chinking for gaps. He reinforced the barn roof against the weight of snow. He brought back from his trapping routes not just pelts, but observations. Reports on the snowpack and the high passes, the behavior of the deer, the signs he read in bark and branch that told him how the season was going to break. "Bad one coming," he said one evening, looking at a low bank of cloud building over the northern ridge. "How do you know?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Deer are moving earlier than usual, coming down from the high country." He paused. "Last time I saw that kind of early movement was 4 years ago. That was a bad winter." "How bad?" 3 families left the valley before New Year's. 1 family didn't make it out. He said this without drama, without the kind of weighted pause that would have made it a story. Just information. We're better prepared than they were. The valley's learned a few things since then. She looked at the cloud bank. Are we prepared? He thought about it again with that same honesty he seemed to apply to everything. We're more prepared than most. There's more I want to get done before the pass closes. He looked at her. You're good at the smoking? My mother taught me. Good. A small nod. I'll get you more venison to work with. If we can fill that smokehouse through the next 2 weeks, we'll be in good shape. We. He said it without apparent awareness. The way people said it when they had already internalized a partnership. She noticed it and chose not to examine it too closely. She visited her father twice in that first week. Thomas Harper had taken up residence in Samuel's spare room, which was arranged with an invalid's practicality. A good fire, easy access to water, the particular quiet of a space organized around someone who needed rest more than stimulation. He was better in the mornings and worse in the afternoons, and the evenings were unpredictable. Samuel's wife, a capable and unsentimental woman named Grace, managed his care with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with illness before. Evelyn sat at her father's bedside on the 6th day and held his hand and tried to reconcile the man in the bed, thin, tired, the breath coming short, with the man who had stood in the kitchen doorway turning his hat in his hands and told her about the arrangement. The fury she had been carrying since Harrisburg had settled into something more complicated and less clean. Grief had a way of doing that. It dissolved the simple shapes. How is it? He asked. With Boone. Fine, she said. He looked at her over the edge of the blanket. Evie. It's fine, Papa. The cabin is solid. He works hard. She paused. He gave me the bedroom. Thomas's expression shifted slightly. Something between relief and guilt. He's a good man. You keep saying that. Because it's true. You had 3 weeks to tell me that before you arranged my life, she said. Her voice was quiet, but not gentle. You didn't. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. No, he said. I know. I should have... He stopped, coughed, collected himself. I thought if I told you first, you would refuse to come. And if I had? I don't know. He closed his eyes. I don't know, Evie. I wasn't thinking about what was right. I was thinking about what was... He stopped again. What was safe? She said. For me. Yes. She looked at the wall above the bed. The logs close and dark, the chinking white between them. That doesn't make it right, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She stayed until he fell asleep, which didn't take long, and then she walked back up the track to the cabin in the early afternoon cold with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds in the still air. The aspen leaves were falling now, coming down in slow gold circles when the wind moved through them, and the meadow had gone pale and stiff with the first light frosts. She was so absorbed in her own thoughts that she was almost at the cabin door before she noticed the repair. The porch step, the second one from the bottom, which had a soft place in it that gave slightly under her weight, had been replaced. New wood, clean cut, fitted in flush. She stood on the bottom step and tested the new board with her foot, solid. She hadn't mentioned the step to him. She had noticed it on the second day and made a mental note to be careful of it and had not thought about it since. He had noticed it too, at some point in the past week's motion, and fixed it without comment, without asking, without making it a thing. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold afternoon and looked at the new board, and felt something shift, very slightly, in the structure of her resentment. Not gone, not near gone, but shifted. It was Grace, Samuel's wife, who told her about the Millers. She had come to the settlement to collect some things from the general store: salt, lamp oil, a new length of rope that Caleb had asked for, and Grace appeared beside her in the narrow aisle between the dry goods shelves with the directness of a woman who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it. Your husband was over at the Miller place last week, Grace said. Not a question. Evelyn looked at her. Was he? Before your wagon had even rolled into the valley, Boone was over there reinforcing their barn. Old Lars Miller can't do that work anymore. Bad shoulder, worse knee. His wife can't do it. Their boy is 10 years old. Grace picked up a tin of something and looked at the label. Caleb Boone has spent the last 2 autumns doing the work Lars can't do. He's never asked for anything in return. Lars tried to pay him once. Boone wouldn't take it. Evelyn set down the rope she was holding. Why are you telling me this? Grace looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who was not going to soften the next thing she said. Because I know what you think about the arrangement. I know because I would think the same thing in your position, and I'm not going to tell you you're wrong to think it. Your father should have talked to you before he talked to Caleb. That was wrong. She put the tin back on the shelf. But I don't want you to look at that man and see only the arrangement, because there's more to see. Evelyn said nothing. That's all I have to say about it, Grace said, and moved on to the next aisle. That evening, she found the note. It wasn't meant for her. It had slipped from the pages of the account ledger Caleb kept on the shelf by the door. She had pulled the ledger out looking for a piece of paper to write on, and the note came with it, a folded square of paper in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She shouldn't have read it. She unfolded it anyway, standing by the shelf in the lamplight, and read it in about 30 seconds. It was short. As discussed, I will ask Samuel to make clear to Mr. Harper that the girl should have time to settle before any formal arrangement is pressed. She should come to it of her own choice or not at all. CB. She read it twice. She put it back in the ledger, smoothed the page, and replaced the ledger on the shelf. She found a different scrap of paper for what she needed and sat down at the table and wrote out a small list of things they needed from the store and did not think about the note. She did not think about the note for approximately the rest of that evening, which was to say she thought about nothing else. The girl should have time to settle. She should come to it of her own choice or not at all. He had written that before she arrived, before he had seen her face or heard her name in a room. He had looked at the arrangement her father was proposing, and his first instinct had been to push back against the pressure, to ask for more time for her. She stared at the fire for a long time after Caleb had gone to sleep on his pallet. She didn't know what to do with a stranger who, before he had ever met her, had already been worried about whether she had a choice. Mom. The second week was colder than the first. The nights dropped below freezing consistently now, and there were mornings when the creek was edged with thin ice and the horse's breath came in thick clouds from the corral. The work shifted with the temperature. More time inside, more time on the repairs and preparations that cold weather demanded. She learned the rhythms of the cabin more deeply, which drawer stuck in damp weather, Which lamp burned dirtier? The particular way the fire needed to be built to get the flue drawing properly. Caleb taught her these things without condescension. He showed her once, clearly, and then let her do it herself. He didn't hover. He didn't check her work with the anxious second-guessing of a man who expected failure. If she did something differently than he would have done it, he looked at the result rather than the method. And if the result was fine, he let it be fine. She caught him once, late in the second week, standing outside in the cold after supper with no apparent purpose, just standing at the edge of the porch light, looking out toward the ridge. She had come to the door for something and stopped. "You all right?" she asked. The question surprised her as much as him. She hadn't planned it. He looked back over his shoulder. Something crossed his face, not quite surprise, but adjacent to it, like a man who had not expected to be asked. "Yeah," he said. "Just listening?" "To what?" A pause. "The valley. This time of year it has a particular sound." He considered this. Hard to describe. Before the snow it gets quiet in a specific way, like it's holding its breath. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling her coat tighter, stood beside him, and listened. He was right. There was a quality to the stillness that was different from ordinary quiet, denser, more loaded. The kind of quiet that had intention in it. "I've never been in a place that could hold its breath," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You have now." They stood there for another minute, maybe two, in that loaded valley quiet. And it was the first time since she had arrived that the silence between them felt like something other than distance. She went back inside first. She didn't examine why. Blah. By the end of the second week, the pass to the east had received its first real snowfall. She heard about it from a man named Jeremiah Cole, who came by the cabin on horseback with word from the settlement. The eastern pass was navigable but narrowing fast, and the Northwest Passage that connected to the lower valley town of Dunmore would be gone before the month was out. After that, Hatchfield was on its own until spring. She stood on the porch after Jeremiah Cole had ridden back down the track and looked at the snow on the ridge, white on the high country now, definitive and descending. The calendar was narrowing, the season was choosing. Behind her, the cabin was warm. The smokehouse was 3/4 full. There was wood stacked along 2 walls. A man who had written, before he ever met her, that she should come to it of her own choice or not at all, was inside starting the evening fire. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind coming down off the ridge and stood there in the descending cold, looking at the mountain that was closing the way out. She was still standing there when the first real snow of the season began to fall. Small flakes at first, tentative, then thickening into something determined. It settled on the porch rail and whitened the corral fence and came down without hurry or drama, the way the valley's most significant things seem to happen, quietly, thoroughly, changing everything. The snow that began falling that evening didn't stop until morning. Evelyn woke to a transformed world, the meadow gone white and smooth, the creek banks frosted over, the familiar shapes of the corral and the barn wearing their new weight with a kind of settled permanence that made the summer landscape feel like something she'd imagined. She stood in the cabin doorway with her coffee and looked at it and felt, for the first time since the wagon had rolled into the valley, something close to stillness in her own chest. Not peace exactly. More like the absence of the particular noise that had been running since Harrisburg. Caleb was already at the barn. She could see the yellow rectangle of lamplight through the gap in the barn doors, hear the low murmur he used with the horses. Not words exactly, just a sound that told them he was there and nothing was wrong. She had noticed that about him early on. He talked to the animals the way some men talk to themselves, consistently, quietly, without self-consciousness. She went inside and started the breakfast. This had become her territory by the second week, not because he had assigned it to her, but because she had taken it. The kitchen end of the cabin was the one domain where she could impose her own order, and she had done so methodically, reorganizing the shelf arrangement to suit her reach, moving the cutting board to catch better morning light, learning the hot spots on the iron stove that could turn a good biscuit into a bad one if you weren't paying attention. Caleb had observed these changes without comment. He ate whatever she made with the same focused appreciation he brought to everything she had seen him do. And when something was particularly good, the venison stew she'd made the previous Thursday with the dried herbs she'd found at the general store, he said so plainly, "This is better than anything I've made in 3 years," he'd said, and gone back to eating. She had chosen not to say anything in return, but the words had stayed with her longer than she expected. He came in from the barn as she was pulling biscuits from the oven, stomping snow from his boots at the door, with the habit of a man who had learned the hard way that wet floors in a cold cabin made for miserable mornings. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down, and she set the plate in front of him and sat across the table with her own. "North Pass took another foot last night," he said. "The east route is probably another week, maybe less. And then we're in. And then we're in." He picked up his coffee. "You need anything from Dunmore before it closes? I can make the ride in the next few days if there's something we're short on." She thought about it. "Writing paper, if it's not too much trouble." "It's not." He looked at his plate. "Anything else?" She hesitated, then, "My father takes a particular kind of tea, for his breathing. The general store doesn't carry it." Grace thought Dunmore might. He looked up at her, not with surprise exactly, but with the careful attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. "What's it called?" "Mullein and Horehound, usually sold together or separately. It helps with the cough." "I'll find it," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without embellishment, without the performed confidence of a man trying to seem more capable than he was. Just a plain statement of intention. She had been around enough men in her life to understand the difference between that kind of quiet certainty and the kind that was actually bluster dressed up in a low voice, and she was increasingly unable to put Caleb Boone in the second category, no matter how hard she tried. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and finished his breakfast. He left for Dunmore 2 days later before first light, with a list she had written out and a day's provisions in his saddlebag. She watched him ride out from the porch in the cold blue pre-dawn, his outline growing smaller down the track until the bend in the creek swallowed him, and then she went inside and spent the day with the particular odd freedom of a woman who is alone in a space for the first time and isn't sure yet whether it feels like relief or loneliness. It felt like both, she decided by afternoon, in roughly equal measure. She visited her father. Thomas was having a better day. Sitting up, some color back in his face, the cough manageable. He wanted to hear about the cabin, about the valley, and she told him things without telling him everything. She described the morning light on the snow-covered meadow. She mentioned the smokehouse and the wood supply and the careful preparation she had watched Caleb execute over the preceding weeks. She did not mention the porch step, or the note in the ledger, or the conversation on the porch about the valley holding its breath. "You seem less—" Thomas paused, searching for the word. "Less what?" "Less like you want to burn something down," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't want to burn something down. Evie." His tone was gentle and accurate. "You wanted to burn something down." She looked away. "I'm adjusting," she said, which was true. Whatever adjusting meant in this context, something was happening that qualified for the word. She got home before dark, made supper, and ate alone in the firelight. The cabin without Caleb in it was quieter than she expected. Not unpleasant, just different. The kind of quiet that had a specific shape because it was measuring the absence of something. She was in bed when she heard the horse on the track, later than she expected. She lay still for a moment and then heard the barn door and the familiar sounds of a horse being unsaddled and watered and settled, and then his boots on the porch boards, and then the particular sound of the front door closing with care, that particular not wanting to wake her quietness that she had cataloged early on and filed away without knowing what exactly to do with it. She heard him put something on the shelf by the door. Then the sounds of a man pulling off his boots and lying down on a pallet in the cold main room after a 10-hour ride in winter conditions. In the morning, on the shelf, there was the writing paper she'd asked for, the mullein and horehound tea, and a small twist of hard peppermint candy wrapped in brown paper that she had not asked for and that he had not mentioned. She stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then she took the tea to her father that afternoon and said nothing to anyone about the candy, which she kept in the tin box with her letters. The East Pass closed 6 days later. She knew the exact morning because Jeremiah Cole rode through again with the news, his horse blowing hard and its legs caked with wet snow to the hock. He stopped only long enough to pass the word. The drifting had come overnight, fast and deep, and the eastern route was gone until the melt. Dunmore was on one side of the world, and Hatchfield was on the other, and that was how it was going to be until March or April, depending on what the season decided. She stood on the porch and watched Jeremiah Cole ride on to the next cabin with his news and looked at the ridge where the pass had been and felt the valley close around them. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the finality of a door being shut, not trapped, but committed. Whatever happened in Hatchfield through the winter happened here with these people, with the provisions they had and the skills between them. There was no sending for help, no going back east to rethink. She went inside and checked the food stores methodically, counting and calculating with the practical precision her mother had taught her, and was satisfied, and then went and split an hour's worth of wood because the action required enough physical attention to quiet the part of her mind that otherwise would have continued cataloging the ways this situation was not the life she had imagined. Caleb came back from the trap line at midday and she told him about the pass, and he said he'd heard from another trapper on the North Trail. And they stood in the cabin going through the provisions together with a seriousness that was also, she noticed, a kind of partnership. He asked her questions and listened to her answers and modified his plans based on what she said, and it occurred to her somewhere in the middle of this exchange that she could not recall the last time a man had adjusted his plans because of information she had provided. "The flower's tighter than I'd like," she said. "If the winter runs long." "I know." He studied the shelf. "I'll see if the Coles have extra. They were in better shape than most in October." He paused. "I should check on the Miller place anyway. Lars's shoulder's been bad. I want to make sure their wood supply held through last week." It was so casually stated that she almost let it pass. "You check on them often?" "When I can." He pulled on his coat from the peg. "They're good people. Hard position to be in." He said this without the performing quality of a man who wants credit for generosity, just stating the facts of a situation. Their boy, Daniel, he's been trying to help with the heavy work. Kid's 10 years old and swinging an axe that's almost as big as he is. She thought of what Grace had told her in the general store. He's never asked for anything in return. "Take the deer meat I put up yesterday," she said. "There's more than we need for this week." He stopped in the middle of reaching for his gloves and looked at her. "You sure?" "The smokehouse is full," she said. "Take it." Something shifted in his face, small, quickly controlled, but there. Not surprise. Something closer to being unexpectedly moved, which he apparently had no interest in showing. "All right," he said. "Thank you." She waved a hand toward the smokehouse in response, because she didn't know what else to do. And he went out and she heard him in the smokehouse and then riding out on the north track, and she stood at the window watching him go with her hand resting flat on the cold glass, and her thoughts somewhere she couldn't quite organize. She was not a person who changed her mind quickly. Thomas Harper's daughter, built on the same stubbornness that had kept him going long past what his body wanted to do, was not given to rapid reassessments. She had built a wall around her resentment in those first weeks with the same methodical care Caleb used on the barn roof, and she had intentions for that wall. It had served a purpose. But walls, she was learning, were only as reliable as the ground they were built on. And the ground was shifting. It shifted in small accumulations. The way he listened, fully, without the impatient quality of a man waiting for his turn to speak. The way he talked about the valley, with knowledge that went beyond information, the kind that came from years of paying attention to something you actually cared about. The things she learned from other people, which were sometimes more revealing than what she observed directly, because he would never have told her about them himself. It was Nora Brecht who told her about the Tanner family. Nora was one of the women Evelyn had begun to know through the incidental proximity of frontier settlement life. They shared a wash day at the creek, traded preserving advice, moved through the general store at the same hours. Nora was German-born and practical, and had the directness of a woman who had survived enough to be done with social delicacy. "Your husband helped the Tanners last spring," Nora said, wringing water from a length of wool with efficient violence. "Did he tell you that?" "No," Evelyn said. "Of course he didn't." Nora moved to the next piece. "Henry Tanner broke his leg in February. Bad break, femur. He was flat on his back for 12 weeks. His wife was expecting. They had no one." She rung. Boone spent those 12 weeks doing Tanner's trapline on top of his own. Split their wood. Kept their animals. He did it before dawn and after dark, so Tanner didn't have to watch him do it. She paused. "You understand what I mean. So Henry didn't have to lie there and watch someone else doing the work he couldn't, Evelyn understood exactly what she meant. He never said a word about it afterward, Nora continued. Henry tried to work something out. Payment, a share of the spring pelts. Boone said no. Said it was just neighboring. She shook her head. I've known men who talked about being good neighbors their whole lives. He just is one. Evelyn hung her piece of wool on the line in the cold air and looked at the creek, running lower now under its skim of ice. Just neighboring. The kind of thing said by someone who had genuinely not considered it anything worth making a story of. She thought about that on the walk home. She thought about it while she made supper. She was still thinking about it when Caleb came in from the evening feeding and washed his hands and sat down. And she looked at him across the table. This familiar stranger, this man she had been living beside for a month, whose floor she had been sleeping above every night, whose habits she now knew better than she knew those of anyone she had left in Harrisburg, and tried to reconcile the man she had expected with the one who was actually sitting across from her. The Tanners, she said. He looked up. Nora Breck told me. About last spring. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression closed slightly, the particular closing of a person who does not enjoy being discussed. Nora talks, he said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. Is it true? Mostly, he said. Nora adds things. What did she add? He thought about it. Probably made it sound more dramatic than it was. He looked at his plate. It needed doing. I had the time. You did your whole trap line and his, she said, before dawn and after dark. I don't sleep much anyway. He picked up his fork. Henry's a good man. He would have done the same. She looked at him for a moment. Would he, though? That stopped him. He considered it honestly, the way she had come to expect, without defensiveness, without false modesty. I don't know, he said finally. I hope so. She let it go. But she didn't let it go. Exactly. She moved it into the part of herself where she kept things she was still working out, alongside the porch step and the note in the ledger and the peppermint candy in the tin box. November arrived with a cold that had real intent behind it. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself gradually, but comes down from the northern ridge in a single night and changes the fundamental nature of the world by morning. The water in the basin had a skim of ice on it when she woke. The window glass was furred with frost on the inside. She lay under her mother's quilt and 2 additional blankets and listened to the cabin protest against the temperature in a series of pops and creaks, and heard from the main room the sound of Caleb building the fire up from coals into something that could fight back against the cold. She dressed under the covers, which was undignified but warm, and came out to a cabin that was already driving the chill back and a pot of coffee that was ready. He was crouched by the fireplace with the poker, adjusting the airflow, wearing a heavy flannel shirt and what appeared to be a look of focused calculation, assessing the fire the way she had come to understand he assessed most things, identifying what was needed and doing it without excess. How cold is it? She said, mostly to herself, cupping the coffee. 12 degrees, maybe 10, he said, without looking up from the fire. You've been outside already. Just to the barn. He replaced the poker. Horses are fine. Watered them last night before it dropped. He stood. Breakfast? I'll do it, she said. They had, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, reached a silent negotiation about the cooking. She made most of the meals and he took care of the heavy outdoor labor. But on the days she was tired or occupied, he did it without comment. And on the days when she wanted to, he stepped back without comment. The negotiation had happened entirely without being spoken. This was, she was beginning to understand, the primary language of Caleb Boone. Things managed through action rather than declaration. Agreements reached through attention rather than conversation. It was a language she had not expected to understand. She was finding she understood it better every day. She made pancakes with the last of a jar of preserves she'd brought from Harrisburg. Black raspberry, her mother's recipe, made the previous August in what felt like a different lifetime. She set a plate in front of him and watched without meaning to watch as he tasted it, and something happened in his expression that was not performance. A small genuine thing, quickly there and quickly gone. The look of a man tasting something that connected to a memory or a feeling he wasn't going to name. Good, she said. Really good, he said. What's in it? Black raspberry preserves, my mother's. He looked at the plate for a moment. Where did she learn to make them? The question surprised her. Not the question itself, but the interest behind it. Real curiosity, the kind that wanted to know not because it was polite, but because he actually wanted to know. Her grandmother, Evelyn said, German woman, came over in the 40s. She sat down. My mother always said her grandmother could make anything from nothing, the kind of woman who could look at an empty field and already see the winter food in it. Caleb ate another bite, listening. She died before I was born, Evelyn continued. I only know her from the recipes. She paused, slightly surprised to be saying this. And the preserves, every August. My mother never missed a year. She taught you, he said. She taught me everything that mattered, Evelyn said. The words came out more quietly than she intended. She looked down at her plate. The rest I've had to work out myself. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just present. The fire and the cold outside pressing against each other through the cabin walls. Then Caleb said, My mother was the same way. And the simplicity of it, the matter-of-fact offering of something personal from a man who offered very little, made her look up. What happened to her? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Fever. I was 14. He said it without self-pity, just the clean edge of a fact that had long since been integrated into the structure of who he was. She knew things about plants, about what to eat and what not to, about how to read the land. He looked at the table surface. Took me a long time to learn that from other people, piece by piece. She could have just told me. I know that feeling, Evelyn said. He looked at her. The things they didn't get to tell you, she said. The things you realized later you should have asked. Something passed between them then. Not dramatic, not a turning point she could have named in the moment. Just recognition. The particular recognition of two people who have both lost something irreplaceable and who can see without explanation that the other one knows what that costs. It lasted only a few seconds, and then he went back to his breakfast, and she went back to hers. And neither of them said anything more about it, but the shape of the silence between them had changed. It continued that way through November. Small changes, small accumulations. She began to notice the things she had trained herself not to notice, because her resentment required a certain deliberate blindness, and she was running out of the energy to maintain it. She noticed the way he handled animals. Not roughly, not with the casual cruelty some men used on working animals, without even realizing they were being cruel. She noticed that when she was tired, he found small ways to reduce her load without making it a statement, bringing in more wood so she didn't have to, leaving water already heated on the stove. She noticed that when the settlement's difficult personality, a man named Garrett Wick, who had a version of himself he presented to everyone and a different version underneath, tried to shortchange a widow named Mrs. Halverson at the general store one afternoon, Caleb stepped in and corrected the arithmetic with a quietness that somehow made it worse for Garrett than if he'd been loud about it. She noticed that he never talked about himself the way men who wanted admiration talked about themselves. What she learned about him came from other people, or from the slow accumulation of observation. He had served 2 years in the army when he was 17. He had come west after. He had tried farming once, in Kansas, and the drought had taken it. He had come to Hatchfield because a man he'd worked a season with had told him the valley was real, and it was. He had been here 3 winters and did not appear to have any plans to leave. When she asked him once, in early November, why he had stayed, why Hatchfield specifically, he looked out the window at the valley for a moment before answering. It's honest, he said. The valley. It doesn't pretend to be easier than it is. What you put in, you get back. What you don't, you don't. He paused. I can live with that. She understood that too. She was understanding more and more things about him, and the problem with understanding a person, the specific danger of it, was that you couldn't ununderstand them. You couldn't go back to the comfortable simplicity of resentment once you had replaced the outline of a stranger with the particular and complicated detail of an actual human being. She was losing the ability to be angry at him for being what he was, and she hadn't yet found the ability to call what was replacing the anger by its right name. Mid-November brought a brief warm stretch, 3 days when the temperature climbed back above freezing in the afternoons and the icicles dripped from the eaves, and the valley had a momentary, deceptive softness. Evelyn used those days for everything that required being outside without the risk of frostbite, including a long walk up the north track to where the land opened into a meadow ringed by old-growth spruce, a place she had found by accident 2 weeks earlier and had been thinking about returning to. She didn't tell him she was going. She put on her coat and her boots and walked out into the pale November sun and went up the track and sat on a fallen spruce at the edge of the meadow for a long time, listening to the drip of melt from the branches and the creek somewhere below her, and the particular loud absence that was the valley without snow falling. She thought about the life she had imagined before Harrisburg. She thought about the life she was inside of now. She tried to map the distance between them and found the map kept shifting. What had looked like a loss from one angle looked different from another. She had wanted to choose her own future. She had been denied that. That was real, and the anger about it was real. But she was beginning to understand that the future you were forced into and the future you chose could occupy the same territory. That the question of whether you had chosen something was, past a certain point, separate from the question of whether it was what you wanted. She was sitting with this thought, uncomfortable and unresolved, when she heard footsteps on the track behind her. Caleb stopped at the edge of the meadow clearing, looking slightly surprised to find her there. He was carrying a length of rope and had the air of a man in the middle of a different errand who had stumbled onto something he hadn't expected. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't know you were up here." "It's fine." She moved slightly on the log, making room that wasn't necessary. "You're not interrupting anything." He stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment, looking at the meadow. Then, apparently deciding something, he came and sat on the other end of the fallen spruce with the rope across his lap. They sat in silence for a while. It was a comfortable silence, which she noted with a private surprise, comfortable in the way that silences between people who have stopped performing for each other could be comfortable. "I come here sometimes," he said, "when I need to think." "What do you think about?" He considered the meadow. "Whatever needs thinking." He glanced at her. "You?" "Same," she said. He nodded, looked back at the spruce trees. "Caleb," she said. He hadn't used his name directly before. She had avoided it somehow, as if using it constituted a permission she hadn't granted herself. He turned at the sound of it. She didn't have a sentence ready. She had the intention of one, but not the words. She looked at him in the thin November sun, this 30-year-old trapper with the reserved face and the extraordinary private kindness, who slept on a pallet on the floor of his own cabin and fixed porch steps before being asked and rode 10 hours in winter cold to find horehound tea, and said the only honest thing she had access to. "I don't know what I am doing here," she said. Not angry, not self-pitying, just true. "I mean, I know the circumstances. I understand why I'm here. She stopped. "I'm still working out what I want this to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said with the same plain steadiness he brought to everything, "That's fair. I need you to know that," she said. "I'm not—" She searched. "I'm not hostile. I stopped being angry somewhere around the second week, and I don't think I'm going to pick it back up. I just need time." "I know," he said. "You know. You're a person who needs to come to things herself," he said. He said it with the thoughtful precision of someone who had been paying attention. "You don't want to be pulled, you want to arrive." He looked at the meadow again. "I can wait." She looked at him for a long moment, the cold coming back into the air as the sun dropped behind the ridge, the sound of the dripping branches, the valley in its brief, soft interval before the real winter hit. "You're a strange man, Caleb Boone," she said. "Probably," he said. Then the corner of his mouth moved, that not-quite smile she had been cataloging since the first week. "I've been told." She felt something loosen in her chest that had been there since August. Not breaking, loosening. The way a knot loosens before it actually comes free, when you can finally see it might. She stood and brushed spruce needles from her coat. He stood too. They walked back down the track to the cabin in the late afternoon light without talking, the warm spell already cooling around them, and she was not sure what had changed exactly, only that something had, and that she was less afraid of it than she expected. The warm days ended. The real cold came back. The valley went white and dense and serious, and the winter they had been preparing for settled in with the particular authority of something that had made no promises about when it would leave. The real winter arrived without ceremony. One morning, the temperature dropped to something that had no business being survived without walls and fire and the specific stubbornness of people who had chosen this valley, knowing what it asked of them. The snow that fell in November had been preparation. What came in December was the thing itself, deep, deliberate, and indifferent to human inconvenience. Drifts built against the cabin's north wall until they reached the eaves. The creek disappeared under ice thick enough to walk on. The world contracted to the distance a person could travel and still get back before dark, which in December was not very far at all. Evelyn had known winter. Harrisburg winters had teeth, but Harrisburg winters had also had neighbors 50 feet away, and a market street, and the particular comfort of a town that kept functioning regardless of what the sky was doing. Hatchfield in December was a different proposition. The settlement pulled inward. People moved between their own structures and their nearest neighbors and not much further. The social fabric of the valley became intimate and local in a way that was sometimes warm and sometimes suffocating, depending on the day and the company. She and Caleb settled into the winter's rhythms the way people settle into the demands of shared difficult circumstance, not gracefully, not without friction, but with the kind of practical accommodation that comes from having no real alternative. The cabin was warm, the food held. The work was continuous and physical and left both of them tired enough at the end of each day that the silences between them were less about guardedness and more about the simple exhaustion of people who had used themselves up doing what needed doing. Thomas Harper's condition in those early December weeks was the thing that lived at the back of Evelyn's mind, regardless of whatever occupied the front. He had good days and bad days with a ratio that was slowly tilting toward the bad. Grace managed his care with the same efficient competence she brought to everything. But there were mornings when Evelyn arrived at Samuel's and heard the cough from outside and felt the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She sat with him when she could. They played cards sometimes. He had taught her cribbage when she was 8, and they still played it the same competitive way, neither of them giving the other anything. It was one of the few spaces where her father's illness had not reached yet, where he was still the man who had raised her rather than the man she was slowly losing. "You look different," he said one afternoon, studying his cards without looking up. "Different how?" she said. "Less like someone walking to a gallows." He played a card. 15-2. 15-4, she said, and moved her peg. "I was never walking to a gallows." "You were walking to a gallows," he said, with the calm certainty of a man who had known her for 20 years. What changed? She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I started seeing him," she said, "instead of what I was afraid he was." Thomas was quiet for a moment, moving his peg. "And what is he?" "Complicated," she said. "Not in a bad way, just more than I expected." Her father looked at her then, over the cribbage board, and in his face was something she recognized as relief mixed with guilt. The particular combination of a man who had done a wrong thing that happened to turn out all right and was not sure he had the right to feel relieved about it. "Papa?" she said. "I know," he said. "I know I should have—" "I know," she said back. "I'm not bringing it up again. I just wanted you to know that I see him. That's all." He nodded. They finished the game. She beat him by 11 points, which was unusual. He was distracted. She let him be distracted without pressing on why, because some things didn't need pressing. The storm that the Valley would later refer to simply as the January storm, because naming it anything more specific would have implied it was a singular event rather than a permanent state of nature, began on the second day of the new year. Evelyn woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she had not heard before, a low, sustained moan coming from the ridge to the northwest. Not wind exactly, but something beneath wind, as if the mountains themselves were under pressure. She lay still for a moment, listening. Then she heard Caleb moving in the main room, and then the front door opened and closed, and she got up and pulled her coat over her nightclothes and went to the window. She couldn't see much. The lamplight from the main room reached about 6 feet into the dark, and then the dark swallowed it. But she could hear. The moan from the ridge was deepening, and even through the cabin's solid walls she could feel the pressure change, the particular drop in her ears that she associated with fast-moving weather. He was back inside in 2 minutes, snow already thick on his shoulders. "Wake up and get dressed," he said. Not alarmed, focused. The voice of someone moving through a checklist. "Full layers, it's going to be bad." How bad? Bad. He was already at the woodpile loading his arms. "I need to get the animals secured. While I do that, fill every container we have with water, every pot, every bucket, everything, before the pipes freeze." She moved. She had learned over the preceding weeks that when Caleb used that particular tone, there was no room in the situation for questions that weren't immediately practical. She dressed in full winter layers by lamplight and filled every container she could find from the pump before it seized at 4 in the morning, and by then the wind had arrived in earnest and the cabin walls were shuddering in ways that made her understand, in her body rather than her head, what a mountain winter at full strength actually felt like. He was in the barn for 2 hours. She kept the fire built high and moved through the cabin, checking the chinking gaps he'd shown her, stuffing extra rags into the places where cold air was finding its way in. She made coffee because it was something to do with her hands, and because he was going to need it when he came back. She did not let herself think too specifically about what it would mean if the barn structure failed, or if the drifts came too fast, or if he didn't come back in from that darkness. He came back in at 6, stiff with cold, ice in his beard. "Horses are tied and calm," he said before she could ask. He sat down heavily and she put the coffee in front of him and he wrapped both hands around the mug and said nothing for a minute, just breathing. "How long do you think it lasts?" she asked. He looked at the wall, as if looking through it at the weather beyond. 2 days, maybe 3. He drank. "We need to check on the settlement when it breaks. Some of the older cabins." He stopped. "Which ones?" "The Halverson place. She's alone. Her roof is borderline." He rubbed his face with one hand. "The Miller cabin, too. Their north wall took damage last month and I patched it, but I didn't like the patch." She thought of Lars Miller on his bad shoulder and bad knee, his 10-year-old boy with the 2 large axe, his wife Anna, who was the kind of quietly capable woman who never complained about anything until the situation was already past critical. "We'll go as soon as it breaks," she said. He looked at her. The word we had not been discussed, but she had said it the way he sometimes said things, as established fact rather than proposal. Something moved in his face. "All right," he said. The storm lasted 2.5 days. Inside the cabin, time went soft and elastic. The wind was a continuous presence, sometimes loud enough to make conversation require raised voices, sometimes dropping briefly to a low howl that was almost worse because it implied the wind was taking a breath before trying again. They played cards at the table. She taught him cribbage, and he turned out to be a fast learner with a quietly competitive streak she found unexpectedly entertaining. He read from one of the 3 books on his shelf, a battered natural history of the Rocky Mountain Territory, and read passages aloud occasionally when something struck him. And she listened and asked questions, and they had the kinds of conversations you can only have when you are weather-locked inside 4 walls with nowhere else to be. She learned that he had been to New Orleans once, briefly, and found it overwhelming and beautiful in approximately equal measure. She learned that he had a systematic way of thinking about land, watershed and soil and elevation, that was less a set of facts and more a way of seeing, like a language he'd developed over years of close attention. She learned that he could not abide dishonesty in small things, the social lubricant kind, the kind where people say what they don't mean because meaning what you say requires more courage than most situations seem to warrant. "I can tell when someone's managing me," he said, on the second evening, watching the fire. "Saying what they think I want to hear. I'd rather have the harder thing." "Most people wouldn't," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "You're not most people." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation. With him, the line between those things was often thin. On the 3rd morning, the wind died. Evelyn woke to a stillness so complete after the 2-day roar that it felt almost loud in its own right. She dressed fast and came out to the main room where Caleb was already pulling on his boots, and they looked at each other with the shared understanding of people who have come through something together and know the next thing is already waiting. Outside, the world was remade. The drifts had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien, shapes that had no relation to the shapes underneath them, soft and enormous in the low morning sun. The path to the barn was gone. The track to the settlement was gone. Everything was gone except the sky, which was a hard, brilliant blue, and the snow, which was everywhere. They dug for an hour before the track was passable for a horse. Caleb worked with the efficiency of a man who had done this before, and Evelyn worked beside him with a shovel she had claimed from the lean-to, and neither of them talked much because the work required breathing. Her shoulders ached by the time they had the track cleared to the first bend. She kept going. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said, and kept shoveling. They rode to the settlement together, her on the second horse he'd saddled without being asked. The valley in the storm's aftermath was silent in a way that felt sacred. Every sound muffled, every surface transformed, the familiar made strange. Other figures were moving through the white landscape as they approached the settlement, people digging out, checking on neighbors, assessing damage with the methodical pragmatism of people who had no time for shock. The Halverson roof had partially collapsed under the snow load. Mrs. Halverson herself was uninjured. She had been sleeping in a back room when the front portion gave, but she was standing in the cold outside her door with the expression of a woman who had not yet processed what she was looking at. Caleb was off his horse and talking to her in under a minute, already assessing, already planning. He got her to Samuel's house and then came back with 2 other men from the settlement and spent the rest of the morning shoring up what remained of the structure so it could be made livable again. The Miller cabin's north wall had held, but only just. When they arrived, Lars was at the wall with his bad shoulder and worse knee, trying to shore it from the outside with boards he could barely lift. His 10-year-old son Daniel was beside him, face red from cold, holding the boards in place with his whole body while his father tried to nail them. Caleb took the hammer from Lars without ceremony. "Go inside," he said. Not rude, just final. Lars looked at him with the complicated expression of a man who needed help and hated needing it. I know you can," Caleb said. "Go inside and get warm. I need you healthy for the rest of winter, not frozen stiff trying to prove something to a wall." Lars looked at him for another moment, and then the stubbornness went out of his face and left something else there, relief, and something older and harder, which was gratitude complicated by pride. He went inside. Daniel stayed. "I can hold the boards," the boy said to Caleb, with the formal seriousness of a 10-year-old trying to be useful in an adult crisis. Caleb looked at him. "Good," he said. "Hold them steady." Evelyn watched this from the snow behind them, holding both horses, and felt something pull in her chest that was not sadness exactly, but was adjacent to it, the particular ache of watching someone be decent to a child who needed someone to be decent to them. They worked through the settlement for the rest of that day. There were 3 other places that needed immediate attention. A blocked chimney at the coal house that Jeremiah had been trying to clear from inside without success. A door frame at the general store so swollen with cold it couldn't close properly. A fence line at the south pasture that had collapsed under drifts and let 2 of the settlement's communal cattle into the wrong field. Caleb moved from one to the next with the focused patience of someone working through a list he'd already made in his head, and Evelyn moved with him, doing what was useful, holding things, fetching things, handling the animals, and at one point taking over the coal chimney job because she was smaller than any of the men present and could get the angle right. "You've done this before," Jeremiah Cole said, watching her work with the long-handled brush. "First time," she said, through the effort. "Natural talent for chimneys," he said. "Thrilling," she said, and the chimney broke loose with a grinding sound and a cloud of soot that covered her face in black. And Jeremiah Cole laughed, and she laughed too despite herself. The surprised, genuine kind, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in long enough that it felt almost unfamiliar. Caleb heard it from across the room. She saw him glance over. The corner of his mouth moved. They got home after dark, exhausted in the specific way of people who have worked past what their bodies thought was their limit. The cabin felt extravagantly warm after the day in the cold. She made supper without thinking too hard about it. A thick soup with dried beans and the last of the smoked pork, bread she'd made the day before the storm. And they sat at the table and ate and didn't talk much. The comfortable quiet of 2 people who have spent a day doing hard work together and don't need to narrate it. She was washing the dishes when he said, from the table, "You didn't have to do all that today." "I know," she said. "The chimney. Someone had to. You didn't have to be someone." She turned from the basin and looked at him. He was watching her with that direct evaluating attention, not a challenge, just honest. "I wanted to be useful," she said. "Is that allowed?" "Obviously," he said. But the way he said it, the particular quality of it, the slight roughness, told her it was not obvious to him, that it meant something she hadn't fully accounted for, her choosing to be there, her doing the work beside him rather than going back to the warm cabin to wait. She turned back to the dishes. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, the note." She kept her hands in the water. In the ledger. I read it. She heard him go still behind her. Last month. It fell out. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. A long pause. All right, he said. You asked them to give me time. She turned around. Before you'd even met me, you asked my father to let me choose. He was looking at this table. Something in his face was careful. Not hiding exactly, but managing. The face of a man who doesn't know how to handle being seen in the part of himself he had not put forward deliberately. It was a reasonable thing to ask, he said. You were... He stopped. It's not right, that kind of arrangement. Not when the person doesn't know what they're agreeing to. But you agreed, she said. You agreed to it. I agreed to give it a chance if you were willing, he said. There's a difference. He looked at her. If you had come here and decided it was wrong and needed to end, I would have found a way to... It would have been sorted out. I wasn't going to hold you to something you had no say in. She stood with her wet hands at her sides. The fire. The low sound of wind still moving over the cabin roof. Outside the window, the white valley in the dark. That's a remarkable thing, she said, for a man in your position. It's a basic thing, he said, for anyone. She looked at him for a long time. This man who thought basic decency was unremarkable, who fixed porch steps before being asked and fed his neighbors, and gave 10-year-old boys the dignity of being useful and slept on his own floor for 2 months without complaint, and had written, before he ever saw her face, that she should come to it of her own choice or not at all. And something that had been loosening in her since November finally came free. Not dramatically. Not the way things came free in stories where a person suddenly understood everything and all the pieces rearranged themselves into a clear picture. More like the way ice breaks in a creek in the early spring. Not all at once, but in pieces. The pressure shifting, the thing that had been locked beginning to move. I'm not afraid of this anymore, she said. I want you to know that. He looked at her steadily. Of what? Of... She gestured slightly, meaning the cabin, the valley, the whole arrangement, the whole complicated situation they had ended up inside together. This. He didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly, good. She went back to the dishes. He stayed at the table. After a while he got up and came to stand beside her at the basin and picked up the dish towel she'd left on the edge and dried the things she washed without being asked, and they finished together in the firelight, standing side by side in the small kitchen end of the cabin, and neither of them said anything else about it because neither of them needed to. But it was different after that. She felt it in herself before she could see it from the outside. A fundamental shift in orientation, like a compass needle finally finding north after months of spinning. She had been living in the cabin. She was beginning to feel it as hers. The rest of January was brutal. The temperature held below 0 for 9 consecutive days in the 3rd week. Not the kind of cold that felt cold anymore, but the kind that felt like pressure, like the world pressing down. Caleb came home from the trap line one afternoon with the first 2 fingers of his right hand white and without feeling, and Evelyn spent 40 minutes with his hand in warm water, watching the color come back in degrees, watching his face carefully because frostbite going wrong could mean much worse things than the loss of feeling. You should have come back earlier, she said. I was almost done, he said. Caleb. She looked at him. The trap line can wait. Your hands can't. He looked at his hand in the warm water. I've had worse. That's not the point. She was not angry exactly, but there was an urgency in her voice she didn't suppress. That's not... Don't use I've survived worse as a reason to keep doing the thing that's hurting you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular quality of a man acknowledging something he had not previously considered. All right. Promise me, she said. If it goes white again, you come back. He looked at her. His expression had the careful quality it got when something was reaching him he hadn't expected to be reached by. I promise, he said. She kept his hand in the warm water until the feeling came back fully, and she was aware, in the back of her mind, that she had just made him promise her something. That he had just made a promise to her, as a person whose wishes about his safety were something he had agreed to honor, and that neither of them had remarked on this, but both of them knew it had happened. The color came back in his fingers slowly, painfully, the way circulation returning always hurt. He bore it without complaint. She kept her hand on his wrist to monitor the pulse, which was a practical necessity And when it was done and she would have pulled her hand away, she found his other hand had come to rest lightly over hers. Briefly, barely a second, before he released it and stood and said he needed to see to the horse. He went out. She stood at the basin with her hand at her side and looked at the water. Her heart was doing something specific, and she recognized it, and let herself recognize it without arguing with herself about it for the first time. It was February now, in everything but name. The worst of the winter was holding, but something else was holding too. Something that had been built through months of shared cold and work and quiet conversation, and the 10,000 small accumulated acts of two imperfect people choosing, day after day, to be decent to each other. She had not chosen this valley. She had not chosen this cabin. She had not chosen the man who lived in it. But somewhere between the porch step and the frostbitten fingers, she had started to. The 9 days of deep cold broke on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew it before she opened her eyes. Something in the quality of the silence was different, less compressed, and when she came out to the main room, the window glass had a different quality of light on it, the hard white of extreme cold replaced by something softer and more tentative. The thermometer on the porch post read 18 degrees, which, in the context of the preceding week, felt almost generous. Caleb was at the table with his coffee and the account ledger he used to track the season's take, and he looked up when she came out, and something in his face confirmed what she'd felt. A slight easing, the look of a man whose shoulders had dropped half an inch without him realizing they'd been raised. "It's breaking," she said. "For now," he said. "We'll get another cold stretch before it's over. But yeah," he looked at the window. "For now." She made breakfast and they ate, and the easing continued through the morning. Not warmth, not anything close to warmth, but the specific relief of cold that has stopped trying to kill you and has settled into merely being inconvenient. By mid-morning, she had the front door open for 20 minutes, just because she could, standing in the doorway breathing the outside air, watching a chickadee work through the snow-covered spruce branches with the cheerful purposefulness of a creature that had never entertained the concept of defeat. She heard Caleb behind her and moved aside to let him pass, but he stopped at the door instead, standing beside her looking out. "Bird's been around all winter," he said, nodding at the chickadee. "I know. I've been watching it." She paused. "I named it." He looked at her with the particular expression he had when she said something that surprised him slightly. Not judgment, just recalibration. "What did you name it?" "Gerald." A beat. "Gerald. It looks like a Gerald." He looked at the chickadee, which chose that moment to puff itself up into a small feathered ball against the cold. "I'll take your word for it," he said. She laughed. Not the surprised, startled kind from the coal chimney, something more settled, more comfortable with itself. He smiled at that, a real one this time, full enough that it reached his eyes and changed his whole face into something she realized she had been waiting to see for months, without knowing she was waiting. It occurred to her, standing in the doorway watching Gerald the chickadee and listening to Caleb Boone actually laugh at something she'd said, that she was happy. Not relieved, not adjusting, not surviving the situation with reasonable grace. Happy. The specific, uncomplicated kind that didn't require examination or justification. She was standing in a cabin doorway in February in a mountain valley she had never chosen, and she was happy, and the fact that it had arrived without her permission or planning made it feel more real, not less. She didn't say any of this. She watched the bird and let the feeling sit, and after a while Caleb went out to check on the trapline damage the cold week had likely caused, and she went inside and stood in the middle of the main room for a moment with no particular purpose, and then got on with the day. The conversation happened 3 days later, and it happened because of Thomas. She had been visiting her father every day through the worst of the cold, making the ride to Samuel's on horseback through conditions that were miserable but manageable, because not going was unthinkable. Thomas had declined through January in ways that were both gradual and sudden, the kind of decline that looked slow until you measured it across a month and realized how much ground had been lost. He slept more. The cough had deepened into something that lived in his chest, regardless of the tea or the steam treatments Grace arranged. On his good days, he was still Thomas, sharp, dry, present, but the good days were rationing themselves. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon to find him sitting up, which was a good sign, with a piece of paper in his hand that he appeared to have been staring at for some time. He put it down when she came in, folded it with the deliberate care of someone handling something that mattered. "What's that?" she asked. "Letter I've been writing." He set it on the nightstand. "For you, for later." He said it plainly, the way he said hard things, not to spare her feelings, because he had always believed she was strong enough to hear the truth, but without unnecessary cruelty either. Just the honest shape of the situation laid flat. She sat in the chair beside his bed and didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm not dying this week," he added. "I'm just organized." "You've always been organized," she said. Her voice was steady. She had been practicing steady for several weeks. He looked at her. "How are you? Really?" "Really?" she repeated. She thought about the doorway that morning. Gerald the chickadee. Caleb's real smile. "I'm good," she said. "Actually good." Thomas studied her with the particular attention of a man who had known her face for 20 years and could read it like a map. "You're in love with him," he said. The words landed in the room with the quietness of a stone dropped into deep water. "Papa, I'm not asking," he said. "I'm telling you what I see." She looked at the folded letter on the nightstand. "I don't know what I am," she said. "I know I—" She stopped. Rebuilt. "I know that when he's not there, I'm waiting for him to come back. I know that the cabin feels like mine now. I know that I—" She stopped again. "I was so angry at you. I know. I was angry for a long time. I know that too." She looked at her father, thin, tired, the breath short, the letter folded on the nightstand for later. "I understand why you did it," she said. "I understand the arithmetic. That doesn't mean it was right." "No," he said. "It wasn't right. It worked out. That's different." He shifted against the pillows. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. When have I ever answered you any other way?" "Fair point." He met her eyes. "Are you happy?" She thought about this doorway. The chickadee. She thought about frostbitten fingers in warm water and a hand resting briefly over hers. She thought about cribbage in a storm and spruce needle meadows and the particular sound of the valley holding its breath. "Yes," she said. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. She watched his face go through something private and then come back. "Then I'll die easier," he said. "You're not dying this week," she said. "You said." "Not this week," he agreed. But they both understood what the letter on the nightstand meant. Some things don't require stating. She rode home in the late afternoon cold with the conversation sitting in her chest, not heavy exactly, but present, like something she needed to find the right place for. The track from the settlement to the cabin was familiar to her now, in the way that routes become familiar when you've traveled them in every kind of weather. She knew where it was slick, where the wind came through the gap in the spruce stand, where the horse liked to drift left if you didn't hold the rein. She had been in this valley 4 months, and it had learned her, and she had learned it, the way places and people do when you stop fighting each other. Caleb was at the barn when she got back, doing the evening feeding. She unsaddled her horse and turned her into the corral and brushed her down, working in the adjacent stall, and for a while they moved through the familiar choreography of the evening barn work in the comfortable parallel quiet they had developed over months. "How was he today?" Caleb asked. "Good day," she said. Sitting up, sharp, she brushed the horse's flank. "He's writing letters, for later." A pause in the adjacent stall. "I'm sorry," he said. "He's not sorry," she said. "That's the thing about him. He's not. He's facing it the way he faces everything, with this terrible practicality." Her voice caught slightly on the last word. She kept brushing. "That sounds like him," Caleb said. She stopped brushing. "You know him. Spent some time with him, at Samuel's, early on. He came around the stall divider, leaning against it. He came out once to check on the south fence when I was repairing it, about a week after you arrived. We talked for a couple hours. He's a good man, your father. Funny, smarter than he lets on." She looked at him. "He never told me that. Probably didn't want you to know he was checking up on me through labor supervision," Caleb said. The dry quality in his voice was something she had come to love. The rare occasions when his humor surfaced, always quiet, always precise, always earning its moment. She laughed despite the tightness in her chest. That is exactly what he was doing. I know, I didn't mind. He paused. He talked about your mother. A lot. The way people do when they're still working something out. He looked at the wall. He said she would have liked the valley. Evelyn set down the brush. She would have, she said. She liked places that asked something of you. The valley does that. Yes, she said. It does. They looked at each other in the dim barn light, the horses moving quietly in their stalls, the smell of hay and cold wood and lantern oil, and the conversation they'd been building toward for 4 months was right there on the surface now, close enough to touch. She felt it, and she suspected he felt it, and they were both, in their particular ways, the kind of people who did not rush toward things. But she was tired of waiting for herself. I want to ask you something, she said. He waited. When you agreed to the arrangement, she said, what did you actually think was going to happen? What did you imagine? He considered this with his characteristic honesty, not reaching for the comfortable answer. I didn't let myself imagine much, he said. I thought a woman who'd been arranged into a marriage against her will was probably going to be angry for a long time, and she'd have every right to be, and maybe over a winter we'd find a way to be decent to each other, functional. He paused. I thought functional was a reasonable thing to hope for. Functional, she repeated. Yeah. And now? He looked at her directly. Now, I don't think about functional. The barn was very quiet. She could hear her own heartbeat, or thought she could. What do you think about? She said. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that she was aware of every second of it. Then, you know what I think about, Evelyn. He had not used her full name before. He had called her nothing, mostly, or occasionally Evie when he forgot to be careful, which happened rarely and never seemed intentional. But Evelyn, in his low voice in the dim barn, had a weight to it that was not accidental, and she felt it through her whole chest. Say it anyway, she said. Not a game, a request. The real kind. He looked at the wall for a moment, the particular look of a man gathering courage for the kind of honesty that could not be taken back. Then he looked at her. I think about the fact that I got incredibly lucky, he said. That whatever went wrong in the arrangement, whatever was unfair about it, somehow the outcome was you, here. And I think about that more than I should probably admit. She held that, turned it over carefully. You think you got lucky, she said. I know I did. Caleb. She took a breath. I was so angry when I came here. I had a speech prepared. Did you know that? I assumed, he said, you had a prepared speech kind of face when you arrived. I practiced it for 4 days in the wagon. She shook her head slightly. And then you gave me the bedroom and went to sleep on the floor, and I had nowhere to put it. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the internal version of one, the thing that happened before it reached his mouth. Sorry about that. No, you're not. No, he agreed. I'm not. She stepped away from the stall and the distance between them reduced, and she looked at him. This man she had been learning for 4 months. This complicated and imperfect and quietly extraordinary person who fixed things before being asked and cried inwardly over dead mothers, and thought functional was a reasonable thing to hope for, and had no idea, apparently, how remarkable it was to be exactly what you were without apology or performance. I came here against my will, she said. You know that. I need you to always know that, because I'm not going to pretend it happened some other way. I know, he said. And I'm choosing this now, she said. I want you to know that too. Not because the pass is closed and I have nowhere else to go. Not because my father is ill and the arithmetic only works one way. Because She stopped. The word was right there, and she had never said it to anyone except her parents. And it was a different thing to say to this man in this barn in this winter. Because I want to. Because you are who you are. Because the last 4 months have been, she looked for the right word, mine. More than anything I've had in a long time. He was very still, the kind of still that meant something was happening inside him that was too large to show. Evelyn, he said. Don't be sensible about this, she said. Don't say something careful. The corner of his mouth moved. I wasn't going to. Good. He crossed the 2 steps between them, and she tilted her face up, and he kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything. Not rushed, not performed, entirely present, entirely honest, and she kissed him back and put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palm going as fast as hers, which was information she found she needed to have. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, both of them breathing. "I've been wanting to do that since November," he said. "Since November," she said. "Specifically." "The meadow," he said. "When you said you were still working out what you wanted this to be." She thought about the spruce meadow, the warm spell afternoon, sitting on the fallen log. "I can wait," he had said. And he had waited. 4 months of steady, patient, floor-sleeping, porch-repairing waiting. "You could have said something," she said. "You needed to arrive," he said. "Remember?" She laughed against his shoulder. "You're insufferable." "Probably," he said, and held her in the cold barn with the horses shifting behind them and the February wind coming down off the ridge, and she thought about what Thomas had said. "Are you happy?" And the answer was exactly the same as it had been in the doorway that morning, only larger now and more specific, and with a name attached to it. They walked back to the cabin together in the dark, his hand finding hers on the path between the barn and the porch. And she let it. And it was simple in the way that things are simple when they finally stop being complicated. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. Nothing in a frontier winter was without difficulty. But they had a different quality than what came before. The pretense of careful strangers was gone. What replaced it was something more honest and considerably less tidy. Because two real people with real histories and real edges do not simply flow together once they've acknowledged wanting to. They bump. They miscommunicate. They have the particular arguments of people who are similar enough to irritate each other with precision. They argued once, badly, about whether to give the last of the dried apple stores to the Halverson family, whose supplies had been badly depleted by the roof collapse. Evelyn said yes immediately. Caleb said he needed to know their own numbers first, and she heard caution where she should have heard practicality, and said something about it in a voice that had an edge. And he went quiet in the way that his going quiet was worse than someone else shouting, and they spent an evening in the same cabin not talking properly. In the morning, he put the numbers in front of her on the table, the actual calculations, supplies versus weeks, with the Halverson contribution already included, and she looked at them and understood that he had been right and that her immediate yes had been impulse rather than math. "I should have just shown you this last night," he said. "I should have asked before I got sharp about it," she said. They looked at each other. "So we're both idiots," he said. "Speak for yourself," she said. "I'm an idiot once. You were an idiot about the communication." "Fair," he said. They took the dried apples to Mrs. Halverson that afternoon. She began to understand him better in those weeks, the texture of him that could only be learned by friction as well as harmony. He had a stubbornness that matched hers in degree, but not in kind. Hers was instinctive, a wall that went up fast, and his was structural, load-bearing, the kind built into the foundation rather than the surface. He was slow to decide certain things, and immovable once he had decided them, and the trick was knowing which kind of decision you were dealing with. He didn't give affection easily or abundantly. It came in specific, considered ways, and learning to receive it on those terms rather than the terms she had expected took adjustment. She was not, she knew, straightforward to live with. She had opinions with edges. She had the particular impatience of a person who thought quickly and was sometimes insufficiently charitable to those who thought differently. She carried her grief about Thomas in ways she had not fully worked out yet, and there were evenings when it came out sideways, and Caleb received those evenings with steadiness that she was grateful for, even when she couldn't say so immediately. But the thing that held, the thing that was real and getting more real every day, was the fundamental orientation toward each other. The choosing. Not the dramatic once-and-done kind, but the continuous small kind, the daily decision to be honest, to try, to be worth what the other person was putting in. February moved towards March, the way the season moved toward anything. Reluctantly, with setbacks, with false promises of warmth that then receded back into cold. Thomas Harper had 2 very bad weeks in the middle of February that brought Evelyn to Samuel's house in a state of controlled fear that she held together through sheer force of the stubbornness she had inherited from him. Caleb came with her both times without being asked, sat in Samuel's kitchen while she was in the back room, available, not intrusive. When she came out the second time with her eyes red and her composure assembled by effort, he stood and put his arms around her, and she let him hold her without trying to manage how it looked or what it meant. "He's still here," she said, her face against his shoulder. "I know," he said. "He's so damn stubborn." "I know where you get it," he said. She made a sound against his coat that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, and he held on and she let him, and that was enough. Thomas stabilized in the last week of February, not recovered, not going to recover, but stabilized in a way that meant the letter on the nightstand could stay folded for a while longer. He had good afternoons again, the cribbage, the conversation. He asked about Caleb with a directness that meant he already knew the answer and wanted it confirmed, and she confirmed it without details, and he nodded and was satisfied, and they played cards. March arrived on the calendar, if not yet in the weather, and with it came the first sounds of the valley reconsidering its position. The creek ice began to creak and shift. The eaves dripped in the afternoons. The light changed its angle, not warm yet, but thinking about it, the way light does when it's beginning to remember what spring felt like. One afternoon in the first week of March, Evelyn climbed to the roof of the cabin to clear the accumulated snow load before the melt made it too heavy. And she was up there with the wooden push broom working the snow off in managed sections when she stopped and looked out over the valley. It stretched below her in its white winter state. The creek line, the settlement smoke, the tree lines on the ridges, the mountains beyond white against the pale sky. She could see the Miller place from here, small and solid to the north. She could see the Halverson cabin with its repaired roof. She could see the track that wound through the valley connecting each structure to the next, the veins of the community, worn into the snow by the winter's traffic. She had hated this valley in September. She had stood in the wagon and looked at it and thought of everything it was taking from her. She stood on the roof in March and looked at it and felt something that was not quite any word she had ready for it. Belonging, maybe. The beginning of it. The sense of a place that knew your name. She heard Caleb below, coming out of the barn, and she looked down at him. He shielded his eyes against the light and looked up at her on the roof with the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by the things the woman he loves decides to do and has moved on to simple appreciation. "You could have asked me to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you want help?" She looked at the remaining snow on the roof. "Sure," she said. He went to the lean-to for the second broom and climbed up, and they worked across the roof from opposite ends, and somewhere in the middle where the sections met, they stopped and stood together looking out at the white valley in the March light. "The pass will open in 4 to 6 weeks, he said. "I know. You could—" He stopped, reconsidered, started differently. "If there's anything you need from the other side when it opens, family, or—" She looked at him. "Are you asking if I'm going to leave?" He looked at the valley. "I'm asking what you want." She stood beside him on the roof of a cabin that was hers in every way that mattered and looked out at a valley that she had been delivered to against her will and had chosen since every day in the 1,000 small ways that choosing actually worked. "I'm already where I want to be," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood on the roof looking at the valley as the afternoon light ran gold across the snow and the first real intimation of spring moved through the spruce trees below them, like a rumor that was finally becoming true. The pass opened on a Thursday in late April. Jeremiah Cole brought the news through the settlement the same way he'd brought news all winter. On horseback, moving cabin to cabin with the particular urgency of a man who understood that information was a form of provision in an isolated valley. The eastern route was navigable. The drifts had pulled back enough. Dunmore was accessible again for the first time since October. Evelyn heard the news from her doorway and felt nothing that resembled the urge to leave. What she felt instead was something she hadn't anticipated, a faint anxiety about what the open pass would bring in. The valley had been sealed for 6 months, and in that sealing had become a complete world, self-contained, knowable. Its people familiar in the specific way that people become familiar when they have survived the same hard thing together. Spring and the open pass meant the world remembering that Hatchfield existed. It meant the resumption of commerce and correspondence and the outside looking in. She mentioned this to Caleb that evening, sitting at the table after supper with the window open for the first time since November, the cold spring air moving through the curtain she'd hung in February. "It feels strange," she said. The pass opening. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. How so? Like, all winter it was just us, the valley, our people. She paused, not entirely sure how to finish the thought. Now it's open again, and I didn't know I'd minded it being closed. He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about things she said that he considered worth thinking about. The valley does that, he said. The closing. First winter it scared me. After that I started looking forward to it. Because it was simpler. Because it was honest, he said. Out there, he gestured vaguely, meaning the world beyond the passes. Out there there's a lot of noise, and here there's just the work and the weather and the people. He paused. I like knowing what I'm dealing with. She understood that entirely. She had come from a world of noise, and the valley's enforced simplicity had, somewhere over 6 months, recalibrated something in her. She was not the same person who had sat stiff and furious on a wagon bench, looking down at a strange landscape and seeing only what had been taken from her. She was not sure yet the full dimensions of who she was now, but she was less afraid of finding out than she had ever been. The wedding was Caleb's idea, which surprised her. He brought it up carefully, on a Sunday morning in early May when the meadow was showing the first thin green through the matted winter grass, and the creek was running high and fast with snowmelt. They were on the porch. She had dragged a chair out to sit in the morning sun, and he was on the bench, and they had been talking about nothing in particular with the ease of people who had stopped needing conversation to have content all the time. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked at him. In the morning light, his face had lost the winter's tautness. He looked rested, or as close to rested as Caleb Boone ever looked. All right. We got married, he said. In October. That was an arrangement. You know what I thought about the arrangement. I know, she said. I want to do it again, he said, properly, with everyone here. Not because the magistrate requires it, but because, he stopped, rebuilt. Because I want you to have the thing you were supposed to have. The choice. In front of everyone. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun, the meadow going green, the sound of the creek carrying winter away. You want to give me a wedding, she said. I want you to have one, he said. There's a difference. There it was again. That precise, careful distinction. The same man who had written, before he knew her face, that she should come to it of her own choice, or not at all. Still making the same argument, months later, in a different key. Yes, she said. Yes, you want one, or yes, you'll have one. Caleb. She looked at him with the expression she had developed specifically for his particular kind of deliberate obtuseness. Yes, both. Yes, the corner of his mouth moved. All right, he said, and went back to his coffee with the studied casualness of a man trying not to show how much the answer meant to him, and failing slightly, which she loved. Thomas Harper cried at the wedding. He tried not to, being the kind of man who had strong opinions about the appropriate public expression of feeling, but the day defeated him. He was sitting in the chair Samuel had carried out to the meadow for him. He could not stand for the length of the ceremony, and he had accepted this with the same terrible practicality he brought to everything about his condition. And when Evelyn came across the meadow grass in the green wool dress, she'd been altering all spring, with the valley's first wildflowers in her hand because flowers were what the meadow offered, and she had stopped needing anything more elaborate, he put a hand over his mouth and turned his face aside briefly. She saw it and loved him for it in a way that the long, complicated year had not diminished, only changed in texture. Love with history in it now, love that had been through anger and grief and the particular ache of watching someone you need become someone you're losing, and had come out the other side still intact. She reached him first, before she reached the magistrate, before she reached Caleb waiting at the front of the gathered settlement, and she bent down and put her forehead against his. Don't you dare, he said, very quietly, meaning, don't you dare make this harder by being kind when I'm already losing the fight against myself. Too late, she said. He laughed, the real kind, the full-lunged kind she hadn't heard in months, and the cough took it away after a second, but the laugh had been real first, and she straightened up and walked to where Caleb was standing and looked at his face, open in a way she had never seen it in October, genuinely open, the reserved, careful surface entirely gone, and felt herself go quiet inside in the best possible way. The whole of Hatchfield was there. Nora Brecht in her good wool coat, the Cole family, all 5 of them, Jeremiah already emotional in the way that large men sometimes are at weddings when they think no one is looking, Anna Miller with Lars at her side, his bad shoulder straighter than usual from the effort of dignity. Young Daniel Miller had somehow acquired a flower from somewhere and was holding it with the self-conscious formality of a boy who has been told this is an important occasion and is taking that instruction seriously. Mrs. Halverson with her repaired house and her indestructible composure. Grace standing beside Samuel, with the expression of a woman who had seen this coming and was choosing not to say so. The magistrate was brief. He had learned from October that these 2 people did not need ceremony to give weight to what they were doing. The weight was already there, had been accumulating since autumn, and what the ceremony was for was the witnessing, not the creating. When it came to her vows, Evelyn said what she had decided to say, which was not the formal language but the true language, because she had learned from Caleb that there was very little reason to use one when you had access to the other. "I came here against my will," she said. "I want everyone here to know that I'm saying that because it's true, and because what comes after it matters more because it's true." She looked at him. "I stayed because of who you are. I'm choosing this because of who you are. Every day that I've been here, I've seen you be exactly who you are without apology or performance, and that is—" She stopped, gathered. "That is the rarest thing I have ever seen in a person, and I am not letting it go." There was a silence across the gathered valley that had the quality of people collectively holding something carefully. Caleb looked at her with the expression she now knew was his version of being overwhelmed. The careful, contained version, everything pushed behind the eyes. He was quiet for a moment after the magistrate gave him the signal. "I asked for you to have time," he said, "when I heard about the arrangement, before I met you." A slight pause. "I asked because I thought a person who's been decided for deserves the chance to decide for themselves. That's all I thought." He looked at her hands in his. "I didn't know that the person was going to be you. I didn't know that I was—" He stopped. Caleb Boone did not make speeches. He said what was true and stopped. "I didn't know I was going to be this lucky." He looked up. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know I know how lucky I am." Nora Brecht was not crying because Nora Brecht didn't cry, but she had pressed her lips together in the particular way that stood in for it. Thomas Harper had given up on the battle with his own eyes entirely. Daniel Miller had forgotten he was holding the flower. After, when the settlement had eaten and talked and filled the meadow with the particular warmth of a community that has come through a hard winter and arrived together on the other side, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the gathering with Samuel, who had been quietly observing the whole day with the satisfaction of a man who had set something in motion and watched it become more than he'd intended. "You wrote to him," she said, "about my father's situation." "I did," Samuel said, "and he agreed." Eventually. Samuel looked out at the meadow. "He asked about you first, not your circumstances, not the practical details. About you. What you were like, what you wanted, what kind of woman you were." He paused. "I told him you were stubborn and direct and that you had your mother's backbone and your father's brain." He said that sounded like exactly the kind of person he'd been hoping to know. She looked across this gathering to where Caleb was talking to Lars Miller, or rather listening to Lars Miller, with the full attention she had watched him give to everyone he spoke to who was worth speaking to. He said something and Lars laughed, a real one, and she thought about what it meant that this man she had been given without her consent had turned out to be someone she would have chosen if the world had offered her the option. The world did not often work that way. She understood that. Most people who were decided for did not end up in a meadow in May, watching the person they loved make an old farmer with a bad shoulder laugh. She did not have a tidy explanation for why it had worked out this way, and she was suspicious of tidy explanations in general. What she had instead was the actual record, a year of hard, specific, imperfect work by 2 people who had decided, separately and then together, that the person in front of them was worth more than the circumstances that had brought them there. That was the whole of it. She didn't need it to be more than that. The valley moved into summer, and the summer was full of the kind of work that has no particular drama and matters completely. The south fence line needed rebuilding after the winter's damage. The kitchen garden Evelyn put in was ambitious and had variable results. The carrots came in fine. The squash got something. She consulted Nora Brecht with the pragmatic willingness of a woman who had gotten over herself on the subject of asking for help. Caleb rebuilt the smokehouse roof with Daniel Miller as what could generously be called an apprentice. The boy had adopted Caleb with the quiet intensity of a 10-year-old who has found a person he wants to be like. And Caleb had accepted this the same way he accepted most things. Straightforwardly, without making a performance of it, showing the boy things with patience and expecting him to do the work properly once he'd been shown. She watched this sometimes without letting Caleb know she was watching. The way he talked to the boy. Straight, no condescension, no false praise, but specific, genuine recognition when something was done right. She thought about the mothers they'd both lost too young, the things that could only be learned in pieces from other people. She thought about transmission, what you were given, what you built yourself, what you passed forward. Thomas Harper had a good summer. It surprised everyone, including him. The warmth helped his lungs in ways the mountain winter had not. And there were weeks in July when he walked down to the creek on his own and sat on the bank with a fishing line, which he had always claimed was not really fishing, but a sophisticated form of sitting outside with an excuse. He and Caleb developed the particular friendship of two people who are connected through someone they both love and have decided to like each other on their own terms. They talked about practical things, mostly, land and weather and the valley's particular character, but underneath it was the steady warmth of mutual respect. On an evening in August, sitting on the cabin porch in the last of the day's heat, Evelyn told Caleb about the child. She told him the way she did most important things, directly, without preamble, watching his face for the truth of his reaction before he had time to arrange it. His face went through three things in rapid succession, a kind of stunned stillness, then something that cracked open. Whatever he kept carefully managed behind his eyes, then the realest version of happiness she had ever seen on him. Unpracticed, immediate, entirely unguarded. He said nothing for a moment, then, "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He looked at the valley. She watched him take it in, this person who had spent years in this place building something solid enough to hold a life, and who was now discovering the life had gotten larger than he'd built for, and who appeared to consider this not a problem but a gift he wasn't sure he'd earned. "Are you—" He looked at her. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "Otherwise fine. Practical questions later." She paused. "Say what you're actually thinking." He looked at her for a long moment with the open face, the meadow wedding face, the unguarded one. "I'm thinking that I didn't know," he said. "When I agreed to the arrangement, I didn't know any of it was going to be this." He gestured at the valley, at the porch, at her. "I thought functional was a good thing to hope for. I had no idea." "Neither did I," she said. "Are you glad?" he asked. The question was simple and entirely serious. She looked out at the valley in the August evening, the meadow green and thick, the creek low and golden in the drought, the aspens on the ridge already thinking about turning, the valley going into its second autumn with her in it, by choice. She thought about the woman on the wagon bench in September, furious and frightened and gripping the seat with both hands, trying to hold on to something she couldn't name. She thought about what it had cost to let go of it, and what she had found on the other side. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad." She meant it the way she meant everything now. Specifically, without decoration, with the full weight of having come to it the hard way. The second winter arrived in October, as first winters do in mountain valleys, earlier than the world outside would have considered reasonable. The snow came back to the high country and then descended, and the passes narrowed, and Hatchfield turned inward again in that familiar way, the world contracting to the knowable, the reliable, the people, and the work, and the weather. But everything had changed. The cabin that had been a stranger space was hers in every room now, reorganized and lived in, and marked by a year of two people making a shared life out of what they had. The woodpile was larger than last year's. Caleb had spent September building it with the specific intensity of a man who understood that someone else was depending on the heat now in a new way. And she had told him he was overdoing it, and he had kept going, and she had let him because some things a person needed to do with their hands. The smokehouse was full. The kitchen garden's successes were preserved and shelved. The calendar on the wall was marked with her handwriting and his, in two different styles that had learned to coexist on the same page. Thomas had moved into the cabin's small back room by then, the room that had been hers when she arrived, the room she had stood in that first evening, pressing her palms flat on her thighs, trying to find a future she could live inside. He and Caleb had managed the negotiation of that arrangement with the practical straightforwardness of men who had agreed there was nothing to negotiate. He had his chair by the fire. He had his cribbage games with Evelyn, which she was now winning more consistently than she liked to admit was related to the fact that he got tired faster. He had the particular contentment of a man who had bet everything on a decision that could have been disastrous and had instead been given something beyond what he dared to imagine. He told her once, on a November afternoon when Caleb was out and the snow was coming down in the easy way of early season snow that is more beautiful than threatening, that he was sorry. A real one, no qualifications. "I know, Papa," she said. "I need to say it properly," he said. Not the version where I'm sorry, but also explaining why it worked out. Just, I decided your life without your permission. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it." He looked at the fire. "I did it anyway because I was scared and I thought I knew better and I didn't trust you to make the right choice on your own." She sat with this for a moment. The fire, the snow outside, the life around her. "And now," she said, "now I know you would have made the right choice," he said. "On your own. If I'd trusted you." He paused. "I don't know if you would have chosen him specifically, but I know you would have found your way to something real, because that's who you are." She thought about this. The honest version of it, not the comfortable version. Would she have chosen Caleb Boone, given open options and time? She would never know. That was the thing about the life you actually lived. It was only one of the lives you might have lived, and you couldn't compare them except in imagination, which was unreliable. What she knew was this: the arrangement had been wrong. Her anger about it had been right. And somewhere in the space between the wrong and the right, two people had built something that was neither of those things. Something that was simply, stubbornly theirs. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "I just wanted you to know it was the real kind. Not the kind that looks like forgiveness, but still keeps a record." He looked at her with the tired, clear-eyed love of a man who was very close to the end of his rope and was choosing to spend what was left of it in peace. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. "I know," she said. "He knows things she would have known, about plants, about land." She paused. "She would have liked the valley." "She would have put in a bigger kitchen garden," Thomas said. "She would have put in a bigger everything," Evelyn said, "and it all would have worked." They played cribbage. He won that afternoon, which he was pleased about in the way of a man who had stopped taking small victories for granted. Snow fell outside the window in long, peaceful curtains. Somewhere in the barn, Caleb was doing the evening feeding. In the spring there would be a child, and the valley would get louder, and the cabin would feel smaller, and they would manage it the way they had managed everything, imperfectly, together, making it work. The valley continued. That was the thing about valleys. They continued regardless, through bad winters and good ones, through what people built and what they lost, through the families that came and the families that went, and the families that stayed long enough to become part of the story the place told about itself. Hatchfield would tell its story for years after. People would remember the winter that closed the pass, the storm that took the Halverson roof, the trapper who fixed things before being asked. They would remember the young woman who arrived in a wagon with her jaw set and her hands gripping the seat, who had been arranged into a life she didn't choose, and who had chosen it anyway, piece by piece, until it was the most real thing she owned. What the valley could not have known, watching that wagon come through the pass in September. What no valley ever knows about the people passing through it was what they were capable of becoming. Not what they were at their best, not what they hoped for themselves, but what they actually built, day after day, in the ordinary, difficult materials of real life. Trust is not a feeling, it is a structure. It goes up slowly, in pieces, tested by weather, and it does not announce itself when it is finally complete. You just notice one day that it is holding weight you couldn't have put on it before, and you understand it has been there for a while. Evelyn understood this the same way she understood most true things. Not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments that added up to something she could finally name. Outside the cabin window, the second snow of the second winter came down soft and even over the valley that was hers now. The fire held, the walls held. Inside, around the table, two people and a tired old man played cards in the lamplight, and the child that was coming waited with the patience of the unborn for a world that was slowly, imperfectly, in ways no one had planned, becoming ready for her.